Yesterday, a group of volunteers were at the Maroondah Festival in Croydon, explaining to any member of the public about BZE and about how we can make this transformation of Australia. The discussion group is a forum for climate change solutions with presentations by experts in the field and is held on the first Monday of every month, apart from tonight, of course. So this month we present 100% renewables, what's new? This discussion group will explore recent advances in modelling of 100% renewable energy scenarios for Australia, with three key researchers in this field. Since the Zero Carbon Australia Station Energy Plan was launched in 2010, two new studies have come out examining the feasibility of 100% renewable energy in Australia, both confirming that it is technically feasible and economically broadly comparable to business as usual in cost. One of these studies came from an academic team at the University of New South Wales, while the other was completed by the organisation in charge of keeping the lights on for 90% of Australia's electricity market, the Australian Energy Market Operator, the AEMO, with input from CSIRO and some of Australia's leading energy consulting firms. I'd like to ask the three speakers to introduce themselves, please.
Cool. All right. Well, the speaking order for tonight, you're very lucky. You're going to have a couple of key people who are heavily involved in a few recent 100% renewable energy studies. So first up, we're going to have Tim Forcey, who is an engineer with several decades of experience in the energy industry. He's been involved in BZE for a while, and he was also directly involved in the early stages of the study that the Australian Energy Market Operator recently did on 100% renewable energy. So who are we speaking first? I'm Patrick. I was one of the project leaders of the BZE Station Energy Plan. I'll give a quick explanation of what some of the modelling in various 100% renewable energy studies means. And then lastly, certainly not least, you're lucky to hear from Dr. Jenny Riesz, who I'd probably say is one of Australia's leading thinkers and commentators on 100% renewable energy. She's got a PhD in, I think, original in physics or biophysics or something. I'll let Jenny speak to that. But she's worked for one of Australia's leading energy consultancies, which has done a lot of groundbreaking work in the field of renewable energy, her own consulting. She's worked for ACON, one of Australia, one of the leading global engineering consultancy. And now she works with a centre at the University of New South Wales, which has a lot of really good research going on around renewable energy and 100% renewable energy work. So you're very lucky to hear from Jenny Riesz later on. But first I'll get Tim to come up and do his bit. So Tim was involved in, as I said, the early stage of the AEMO study, and will explain I guess the inputs, modelling inputs that went into that. So Tim wants to get away this as well.
Testing, testing. No, nothing there. Testing, testing.
Did work before.
It did work before.
Maybe it's a bit loud.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, I don't have any problem with that. Okay.
So,
Let it go? Right. Well, thanks, Patrick, for inviting me to contribute this evening to speak about renewable energy resource assessment. For 30 years, I worked as a chemical engineer. That's a bit short of several decades, but 30 years anyway. I worked in petrochemicals and then oil and gas with ExxonMobil and BHP, and more recently, I worked for 2 years in gas and electricity with the Australian Energy Market Operator. These days, I'm employed by the University of Melbourne Energy Institute, which also has an acronym, NEI. So on behalf of UOM, which is the University of Melbourne, I'd like to welcome you along tonight. And we're handing out a free book if you didn't pick one up on the way in. This is Dr. Seligman's work from 2010, another renewable energy study. So you can grab one of those. I've been a volunteer with Beyond Zero since 2008, and it was because of my volunteer exposure to renewable energy at Beyond Zero, and then collaborating with the many talented people there, that I was able, when the need arose at AEMO, where I was working, I was able to put up my hand and work on yet another 100% renewable energy plan. So thanks to all those BZE people that I've met along the way, and I'm very pleased to be able to present tonight with Jenny and Patrick. BZE's Stationary Energy Plan was launched at Australia's Parliament House in Canberra in 2010. And BZE's work found that it is possible to produce 100% of Australia's electricity and to displace 100% of Australia's use of oil and gas with renewable energy. The required facilities would not be that expensive and could be built in as little as 10 years, were there the political will to do so. Many people in Australia became enthusiastic about Beyond Zero's report. You see some of them there. But it was recognized that before the concept of a 100% renewable energy could become reality, it would have to be taken up by organizations that are actually responsible for planning aspects of Australia's future energy supplies. And so 1 year later, in July 2011, the Australian government, as part of their Clean Energy Future package, directed AEMO to produce a report detailing the costs and technical and operational feasibility of producing 100% of Eastern Australia's electricity with renewable energy, which raises the question, who is AEMO? For tonight's purposes, we can describe AEMO as the key organization responsible for keeping the lights on in Eastern Australia. AEMO actually operates control rooms that oversee the electricity grid and generation. And they operate the national electricity market, known as the NEM, where electricity is bid, sold, and dispatched minute to minute. And AEMO also has certain planning responsibilities, again, largely aimed at keeping the lights on, but also working out within certain political constraints what are the lower cost ways to supply electricity, including some consideration of how our economy will or might change in the future. AEMO's 100% renewable electricity report was produced earlier this year. And there's a copy of that. With respect to resource assessment, which is what I'm talking about tonight, it is more detailed than BZE's work. Extensive renewable energy resource background data prepared for the AEMO study is available at this Australian government website shown here. So you can find it just by Googling AEMO 100%. Nearly everything that I will talk about tonight is available at that website. You are welcome to download over 300 megabytes of reports and data files, hourly wind, solar, and wave data, biomass, geothermal information. Indeed, I would recommend that you do download this information in case the current Australian government sees fit to terminate this website. This is a serious amount of detailed renewable energy resource data that has never been published before. But staying at a high level, what did AEMO and their sub-consultants actually do with respect to resource assessment, and what did they find? The first thing I need to show you is the polygon map. You may know that the Eastern Australian, Northern Territory, and Western Australia electricity grids are not connected, and AEMO is only responsible for Eastern Australia. So what AEMO did for this study was to break up Eastern Australia into these 43 locational polygons. Unfortunately, since AEMO has no responsibility for Western Australia or the Northern Territory, those areas were excluded. Now, why did AEMO choose 43 polygons and not more or less? This scale was chosen because, particularly from an electricity transmission perspective, it provides adequate resolution. In other words, if we jump ahead to a slide from AEMO's final modeling results, we can look at, say, polygon 23 in New South Wales. And we can think about what are the renewable energy resources in that polygon, and how could you transmit that energy to the demand centers on the coast. This slide shows the process that AEMO used to execute the study. Now, there's not time for me to go through this in detail, but you can see there's a mention of scenario descriptions, electricity demand profiles, energy storage technologies, energy generation technologies, and costs. But focusing on my topic tonight, that's across the top line here, which is the energy resource assessment. There's 3 deliverables. The first deliverable was the raw, or natural resource data, such as wind speed, or tons of biomass, or for solar, GHI, and DNI. This next deliverable was to take that raw energy resource data and, by applying a certain renewable energy technology, convert it to electricity via an energy conversion model. And finally, this third deliverable was an assessment following a land area and site exclusion process of just how much of this electricity generation capacity you could install in each of the 43 different polygons for each of the different technologies that was studied. EMO's consultants arrived at a figure for this maximum installable capacity by considering not only the location and quality of the natural resources of each location, for example, using all of the data from the Met Bureau weather stations, but also by going through a detailed land exclusion process and assessing competing land uses, environmental and societal constraints. They did this by applying massive amounts of mapping and GIS data, as shown here. I was just amazed by what they were able to do in a very short period of time. But which generation resources and technologies did AEMO actually study? Here's a list of 9, and I won't read these out, but I'll point out that the 2 generation technologies used in the BZE report are on this list. The 2 main ones were the BZE used were onshore wind, and of course, concentrating solar thermal potential receiver and molten salt thermal energy storage, such as you see on the cover of the report. This technology is now recognized as an obvious choice for Australia if we are to move to high penetrations of renewable energy. Many renewable energy technologies were excluded. It may have been because of the study budget and the time constraints we had, but also because it was judged that including additional technologies was not going to significantly influence any of the key study outcomes. Geothermal and wave were included, and many would say that these technologies are not proven to the extent today that they can be reliably costed. However, keep in mind that AEMO's target scenarios were 2030 and 2050, so they had a longer-term time frame than the 10-year period that BZE focuses on with a view to the climate emergency. But with just this short list of resources and technologies, just looking at these, we were able to add up an amount of recoverable electricity that we could produce in those polygons, which was equal to about 500 times the amount of electricity generation that we currently have in Eastern Australia. And I'll show you more of that in a moment. So here's some of the results. First, let's just have a look at onshore wind. Again, all this information is in those reports and data files. This map shows the maximum installable capacity of onshore wind for each of the 43 polygons following that extensive land use exclusion process. Rowan Consulting's analysis excluded some polygons altogether, like these gray ones, because it was not seen that there was potential wind farm sites in those locations that were able to exceed a world-class capacity factor of 35%. And if you know your wind, you know that 35% is excellent. Whereas the polygon with the highest amount of installable onshore wind capacity was number 27 here in South Australia, which was found to have a maximum installable onshore wind capacity of 128 gigawatts. Now keep in mind that all of the large-scale electricity generation in Eastern Australia today, including coal, gas, and renewables, has a generation capacity of only about 50 gigawatts. So in terms of installable capacity, in this single polygon, one could install enough onshore wind to power Eastern Australia 2.5 times over. And this is after Rome excluded national parks, areas populated above a certain amount, other sorts of land use, and other unsuitable areas. And all wind farms with capacity factors less than 35%. When you add up all of the included wind generation capacity for all of the polygons shown on the map, it adds up to an amount 18 times larger than all of today's current generation capacity in the eastern part of the country. That's just for wind. Let's look at solar. Here's the example for utility scale PV, single axis tracking. Rome did a similar analysis as for wind, and here we see that no polygons are colored gray, meaning that none of them were completely excluded. You could economically get solar energy from any of those polygons, even down in South Tasmania, because compared to, say, parts of Germany, where we know they have a lot of PV installed, Australia's PV resource has reasonable capacity factors in every polygon. Again, Rome excluded land reserved as national parks, other sorts of conservation areas, populated places, and most importantly for PV, they excluded all land that has slope of more than 1%. Now let's just look at polygon number 23 in New South Wales. Rome determined that polygon has a maximum utility scale PV installable capacity of over 1,000 gigawatts, 20 times greater than the present size of Australia's current generation capacity in just one polygon. Clearly, Australia's vast land area means that we will not have to go to the great lengths that we are seeing happening in other countries, such as this 70 megawatt, nearly offshore PV facility in Kagoshima Prefecture, Japan, which started up earlier this month. This project was announced in April 2012 and was complete a year and a half later. This is 7 times larger than Australia's largest PV facility over in Western Australia. This illustrates the length that some countries are going to with respect to harvesting renewable energy. Clearly, Australia has some strategic advantages when it comes to renewable energy. Here's another example, biomass. This slide shows the results by Polygon for 7 categories of biomass. These figures add up to recoverable electricity of 108 terawatt hours a year, which could power about half of present-day Eastern Australia just from biomass. The polygon with the greatest biomass resource is Victoria. To sum up, these are the 9 renewable electricity generation resources and technologies that AEMO studied. If we add these all up, we see totals ranging from 86,800 to 116,900 terawatt hours per year, and this compares with our current electricity demand of 200 terawatt hours per year. So there's over 500 times as much capacity out there in renewable energy that could be harvested. BZE was the first to model, hour by hour, how Australia's electricity demand could be reliably met by this mix of renewable energy generation and storage technologies. But so far I haven't talked about energy storage. What BZE's modeling found, and what every study finds when they look at this for Australia, is that when you employ solutions based largely on wind and concentrating solar thermal with salt storage, there are periods in the winter lasting for about a week where the wind does not blow much across most of Australia, such as depicted on this weather map for the 31st of July 2012. And given that the sun is also low in the sky in winter, it would be quite costly to build more and more solar plants to chase that sun. So BZE's work found that it was more cost-effective to use a backup source of stored energy. In addition to existing hydro, BZE's plan to use biomass as the backup energy source during these critical winter periods. Later, as AEMO prepared for their modeling, AEMO considered this list of storable energy resources: existing hydro, biomass solids, just like BZE, biogas, which is generated from biomass solids, molten salt used in conjunction with the solar thermal, and AEMO also tested if electricity storage devices might be cost-effective: batteries, compressed air storage, and pumped hydro, both fresh and seawater. That's it for me. That's my quick overview of energy resources. And so I'll have to hand over now to Patrick to talk more about the model of each
Cool, thank you, Tim. Now, there's 3 main points I'd like to impress on the audience tonight. I'll come to the others later, but the first one is that Australia has an absolute truckload of renewable energy. I guess it's something we've known for a while, but to actually have that study done, and that was, most of the work there was put together by the CSIRO and Rome Consulting, looking at all those different energy resources. We actually have a number that we've got over 500 times our current energy consumption of renewables just in the eastern part of Australia, is a pretty staggering figure. Now I'll talk a bit about how these various studies then, I guess, made it all add up. So, am I clicking with the mouse, Al, or no?
White mouse.
White mouse.
Your one's loaded. Just
Yep.
Patrick.
No?
You know menu, Patrick. You should bring it up. Is that you?
Yep, that's it. Cool. So I'll pretty much keep on going from where Tim left off. So this is, I'm assuming most people have probably seen this before, this is our, the map of our renewable energy sites, and we looked at solar and wind all across Australia, and found basically just what Tim said, is that if you look at our actual electricity demand, that's over an entire year, this modelling. Look at hour by hour, how much wind, how much solar is available at each time. then you can meet the vast majority of our energy needs with wind and solar and energy storage. There's a few points in the middle of this where it gets a bit tricky. And that's just like our current system now. If AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, only had to ensure that the lights stayed on 95% of the time instead, or 98% of the time instead of 99.998 or 9998 or something like that, then your electricity would be much cheaper because we'd spend a lot of money on a lot of infrastructure that's just there to meet that need, only 10 or 100 hours a year. So there's now been a whole bunch of studies that looked at 100% renewable energy in Australia. I was chatting with Jenny before. She's just been over Europe for a conference, and it's interesting how, in some ways, Europeans are quite advanced with how much they're doing, but in other ways, they haven't actually done as much detailed analysis of this kind of thing, of how would you run companies on renewable energy. So, in the same year that ours came out, Melbourne Energy Institute and another professor also published a piece of work which was looking at high level of 100% renewable energy, Australian sustainable energy without the numbers. At UNSW, from the very group that Jenny works with, there's been a couple of papers done that have looked in more detail. I had some more complex modelling tools and being able to sort of optimise and test out different scenarios of 100% renewables. And of course, the Australian Energy Market Operator, which is quite important. I mean, this is literally the organisation that's in charge of keeping the lights on for 90% of Australia. They've come out and said, yes, it's technically feasible to do this. So that's a pretty landmark study. Now, and all of them are pointing to the same results. They're saying, wind and solar can do the vast majority of our energy needs, and the rest can be made up with some combination of concentrating solar power with storage, biomass energy in various forms, and a bit of hydro. And pumped hydro is something which none of them explored in detail, but it's certainly another form of energy storage, which has a lot of potential. And MEI has been doing some work, in particular looking at how there's quite a lot more potential for using seawater pumped hydro storage in Australia than previously thought. So the UNSW studies, there's been 2 papers in the peer-reviewed journal Energy Policy, which is a fairly well-respected journal, that did similar kind of things that we did, took hourly data of wind and solar from various places around Australia, looked at having more PV on rooftops, as we're seeing that's happening quite a bit. They looked at different scenarios. What if you have more or less storage? What if you make different assumptions about the cost of the technologies? In particular, I'll show you some more results in a minute. They even applied a genetic algorithm to try and optimise and find the best way of doing it that they could, which is something that our original state didn't have resources to do. And then, of course, there is, as I said, the Australian Energy Market Operator. This is just a snapshot of some modelling they did as well. Very, very similar stuff in a lot of detail. They took all of that data, of wind, of solar, of biomass, and everything. This is over a period of about a week. They looked at every hour of the day, how much of each of the renewable energy resources was available, and how that could meet demand. And up the top there you can see in the dotted line, they even looked at how, with the dotted line, you could sort of shift demand around, like turn certain loads off, and then at night when there's not much energy, and turn them on in the middle of the day instead. Now, there's really only a couple of things I want to get across here. I'll just note they did look at a few different scenarios. They looked at scenarios where in the future renewable energy technologies get a lot cheaper, a lot faster, and there's a lot of energy efficiency. And they also looked at scenarios where renewable energies don't get as cheap, and there's not as much energy efficiency, and demand continues to grow. Don't need to run the details of that. The point is being that they just looked at a few different scenarios. I'll go into the actual results in a sec. There's one other very important thing that AEMO did, as well as doing that work of getting the solar and the wind and the renewable energy, other renewable energy resource data and looking at that every hour across the year. They also went to their team that's mainly electrical engineers that's more involved with the details of grid management, and asked them to think what are some of the really technical issues you think there might be around with having all these different types of generation on the grid that we don't deal with as much. Are there any electrical engineering issues? And The main ones I looked at are there. I'm not really going to go through them. They're in the report if you'd like to, but basically they said their high-level operations review found that those issues appear to be manageable and should not prevent a secure and reliable 100% renewable energy future in the end power system. With the caveat, of course, that, while I think at a high level it should be fine, once you actually get to the stage of doing it, you need to be doing some more in-depth studies. So that's pretty important. So that's from the electrical engineering power systems perspective. But I guess what a lot of people are interested in is what's the mix, what's the answer, what are the different renewable energy systems, what are the different answers or the outcomes of the study. And this is yet another confusing graph. And I kind of made it deliberately a little bit confusing because the point I want to make is that this doesn't matter. It doesn't actually matter what sort of combination of renewable energy we have. The AEMO study had 4 scenarios that are shown, the first 4 on the left. The recent UNSW paper had another 4 scenarios where they optimised to find least cost with different assumptions about the cost of technologies in the future and what discount rate we apply to financial calculations, and ZCA is over in the corner there. So that's just looking at the percentage of each type of renewable energy technology. The point about this is that all of these studies, again, you could have technically reliable 100% renewable energy systems with quite wildly differing amounts of different technologies. So some of the AEMO scenarios are on the far left there. Their assumptions had geothermal not only coming into existence but becoming quite cheap out into the future, and therefore it would make a lot of sense to have a lot of geothermal. In other scenarios, and also in the UNSW, they found that, well, if wind power remains to be the cheapest form of renewable energy and solar PV keeps on getting cheaper, which it is, then you can have a grid which is made up of over half of just wind and solar power, and you can use various combinations of solar thermal storage and hydro and biomass energy to make up the difference in those times when you need reliable dispatchable forms of power. And so the point is here that you can, from a technical perspective, there's no real issue with having different amounts of different technology, even really variable ones like wind and solar PV. The main differences in all of these scenarios was what assumptions were made about the costs of different technologies in the future, how fast different technologies were going to get cheaper as we build more of them, as we get more experience and as more research is done. And I really have to say that after looking at this stuff for a few years, while there's a lot of work done out there by people, I've done some of myself to try and make these projections and figure out what's going on and really find out what's likely to happen over the next 10 or 20 years. It's mainly an exercise in making up numbers. We don't really know how much technology is going to cost in 5 or 10 years or 20 years. And the biggest factor affecting how much renewable energy will cost is not what some assumption someone puts in a report is, but it's how much we build as a result of government policy to actually drive roll out of renewable energy and drive the costs down. So that's really the biggest factor, and that can happen as soon as or as late as we like it. So that's the main point, really. We can have pretty much 100% renewable energy system any way we want it, mostly. Well, a lot more ways, America they call it. And it really all comes down to costs. And that's where I'll hand over to Jenny before leaving you just on this last slide, which I like to point out these days. That in Australia, domestic energy makes up on average 2% of the average household bill. This is data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. In comparison to 19% on housing, 16% on transport, 3% on alcohol. So just important to have context. All right. I'll now hand over to Jenny. Now, what do we have to do with the technical setup? Should I stand here and flip through the slides?
And also just say hello, and you said he comes from this music.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
We can hear you. Stand up in the slides.
I need to be running all my video conferences out.
Sorry, I missed that.
So I'll send you the slide. Yep. Cool. All right. You're on video, and the slides up, so you're good to go.
Sounds working?
Yep.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak tonight. It's really fantastic. And hi everyone. I'm sorry I can't see you. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. But good to keep the carbon miles down. So if we go to the next slide. So very briefly, just an introduction to myself. As Pat said earlier, I started out my career at the University of Queensland studying biophysics of all things. But at the end of that, really wanted to do something a bit more practical, and particularly wanted to really work on renewable energy. So I went to work at Rowan Consulting, who were the organisation who did a lot of the data preparation that Tim was talking about earlier. And AECOM, a big engineering consultancy after that. And while I was working at those consultancies, I worked for a huge range of clients, and I've got some of the logos up there. A real cross-section right across the electricity industry in Australia, right from the coal organisations, the network operators such as AEMO and also the West Coast, and so on. And now I'm working at the Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets at the University of New South Wales. And our group is very interested in 100% renewable studies. As Pat said, my colleagues have put together another study looking at 100% renewables and really optimising what that mix might look like. And my personal interest is really around electricity market design and how we get electricity markets functioning with 100% renewables. So go to the next slide.
Yep.
So, as Pat has said, this study from AEMO has concluded that 100% renewables is technically feasible for Australia. And it really can't be overstated how significant that is coming from the Australian energy market operator. They have done the most comprehensive study that I've seen done anywhere in the world. And coming from them, it really is very credible. They are possibly the most conservative organisation, and it's their job to be because they have to keep the lights on. And so for them to say that we can maintain a reliability standard, we can manage these operational issues, is a real landmark, very, very significant, and it's already changing minds in the electricity sector. And so it really does come down to then a question of cost. We know that we can do 100% renewables if we want to. It's a matter of how much is this going to cost and what's the cheapest way of doing it. So if we go to the next slide.
Sure.
So these are the costs that they came up with for the two different scenarios, as Pat said, and they looked in 2030 and in 2050. You can see the top two lines there, total cost in billions of dollars. So we're talking somewhere around $200 to $300 billion to build an entirely new power system out of 100% renewable energy, which is a big number. It sounds like a lot. But when you consider that we already spend billions of dollars on our power system every year, when you aggregate up the electricity bills that everybody in Australia pays, that's a lot of money. So we're already spending a lot of money keeping our existing fossil fuel system running. So what we would really be doing here is channeling that money towards renewables instead. So when you turn that into the wholesale cost, which is the bottom two rows, you can see that 100% renewables cost somewhere between $111 to $133 a megawatt hour, depending on how many assumptions you use. And that's actually about double what we pay for wholesale electricity at the moment. The average wholesale price is about $55 a megawatt hour. And so going to 100% renewables would require approximately doubling of the wholesale cost of energy, according to AEMO's data. We get the next slide.
Yep.
But when you consider that the whole cost of energy is only about a third of our electricity bill, it really starts to put it in perspective. So the blue wedge there is the wholesale cost. And we double that from, say, $55 a megawatt hour up to $110 a megawatt hour, which is about what we might need to do for 100% renewables. The whole bill only goes up proportionally much less because you're paying for all sorts of other stuff. You're paying for the distribution network most of all. That's the huge yellow chunk. Those low voltage poles and wires that feed the energy into everybody's individual houses cost a lot, and that's most of what we're paying for. There's also the transmission network in the red wedge there, and your retailer, ACL or Origin or whoever you're with, also have take a chunk because they manage their cost of managing your bill, and they also take a profit margin and so on. So you pay for all this other stuff, none of which is affected by a move to 100% renewable, or at least not affected very much. So if you were paying $300 a quarter at the moment on your electricity bill, to move to 100% renewables might cost you around $390 a quarter. So it is more than what we're paying now. But if you ask me, for 100% renewable energy, an increase in your bill of about 20 to 30% is incredibly good still, in my opinion. So go to the next slide.
Yep, agreed.
So, the other factor we need to take into account is that electricity prices are almost certainly going to go up anyway. So this graph is showing you projections for the gas price on the east coast of Australia. You may have heard about the LNG export industry and a lot of debate around gas fracking and a lot of issues to do with the gas industry. This is because it is ramping up massively on the east coast, and the companies involved in that are looking to export most of that gas. When they do export that gas, and that becomes a massive industry, it will swamp domestic consumption for gas, and the price of gas in our market will become driven by the international price for gas. And internationally, people pay a lot more for their gas than we do in our domestic market at the moment. So at the moment, you might pay $5 or $6 a gigajoule if you're buying gas on a commercial scale. This projection is showing that that might go up to around $12 a gigajoule, or it could go up as high as $16 a gigajoule. So a massive increase in the price of gas. Now, if you want to make electricity from gas, that means that your electricity is going to go up proportionally by that much. So doubling or perhaps even tripling of the price of electricity from gas. Now, we don't make a lot of energy from gas at the moment, but given that we're looking to try and decarbonise our power system, and there's a big push from both state and federal government to try and get the gas industry off the ground, it's not inconceivable that they'll push a lot of generation into gas, and we'll be exposed to these price rises. So that's going to be potentially driving up our electricity price if we're making energy from gas. We go to the next slide.
Yep.
We also know that we do have growing pressure to reduce our greenhouse emissions. Now this graph is showing two possible trajectories for how Australia should reduce our greenhouse emissions, as recommended by the Climate Change Authority, which is, the official report came out just a couple of weeks ago, and it comes from a diverse panel of economists, scientists, industrial representatives, who came together and formed a view as to what the appropriate carbon targets for Australia would be. And it said unequivocally that 5% reduction by 2020 is not even close to enough. We should be doing at least a 15% reduction by 2020 from 2000 levels, and possibly as much as a 25% reduction. And interestingly, they said it doesn't really matter which one of those you want. If you do a 25% reduction by 2020, you go a little bit faster early on, which is the dark blue line there. But then you can go easier later. Whereas if you go only 15% by 2020, you have to go a lot faster later on. Either way though, this is saying that what a fair contribution from Australia would look like is much, much more than what we're promising at the moment, and very serious reductions in our emissions. And we know that the electricity sector is going to be key if we move to the next slide there.
Yep.
So this is showing you where our greenhouse emissions come from, and that big orange chunk on the top is our electricity. So it's the biggest single source of emissions in Australia. It's also the place where we have the most obvious and easy opportunity for abatement in greenhouse emissions. So we know that the electricity sector has to be a big part of reducing our greenhouse emissions. It's the obvious target, it's the cheapest option, it's available commercially now for us to move to renewable energy. So we're going to have to see dramatic change in electricity. And if we don't move to decarbonise our power system, that means we're going to be exposed potentially to carbon prices. So we go to the next slide. Now we have a government at the moment that said that they want to repeal the carbon price, and they may very well do that. In fact, it looks like they probably can. But inevitably we're going to need something like a carbon price to represent the cost of continuing to burn carbon. Now, this 303 here is showing what carbon prices should probably look like if we're up around, I've drawn a 17% target, or up to a 25% target reduction in 2020. And you can see that that means the carbon price by, say, 2030 is around $100 per megawatt, per tonne of carbon dioxide. So it's a very serious carbon price, and if we're going to put that on our electricity price, all of the carbon costs of our current power system, that will drive up electricity prices significantly. But if we shift to renewable energy, we're not exposed to those costs. Have you got the next slide? So to really take all of these factors into account, we tried to study looking at these AEMO 100% renewable scenarios and compare the cost of those scenarios with other modelling scenarios that have been done. So we looked at a study by the Treasury, the Federal Treasury, which is the blue dot there. They looked at a number of scenarios with increasingly severe reductions in greenhouse emissions. There's one with no carbon price, one that was consistent with a 550 parts per million reduction in greenhouse gas, and one that was consistent with 450 parts per million, which is considered much closer to a safe target. You can see that the 450 parts per million scenario there, what I've drawn on the left axis here is the greenhouse emissions associated with that scenario, and along the bottom is the cost of that scenario. You can see the renewable scenarios in the green down the bottom there. And that Treasury scenario at 450 parts per million is smack bang in the middle of where those renewable scenarios fit. So it's saying that to our emissions down to a reasonable safe level, or something approaching a safe level, we're looking at the same sort of cost anyway, as it would to cost to go 100% renewable energy. And there's another scenario there to show that it's not just one-off. There's some studies by the CSIRO that are showing the brown and the red. Those scenarios look slightly cheaper than the 100% renewables, they're slightly less, but you can see the greenhouse emissions intensity of those scenarios is quite a lot higher. So that would not be sufficient to get to a safe, fair contribution to a safe climate. And that's up in 2030. If we go to 2050 on the next slide, you can see that the 100% renewable scenarios are looking even better. They're really about the same cost as all of those scenarios from the CSIRO, and in some cases might be cheaper if we're looking at high fuel prices, high gas and coal prices. And so the renewable scenarios are actually cheaper than the Treasury scenarios, looking at 450 parts per million. So what this is saying to us is that 100% renewables is technically feasible and is about the same cost as the other sorts of scenarios that we're looking at for the future. If we want to be anywhere close to where we need to be to meet the carbon targets and more fair. So to summarise on the next slide there. This study from AEMO, as I said, we really can't overstate how important the study is. It's a very comprehensive study, and the most comprehensive I've seen in any nation so far. And then they concluded that we can meet the reliability standard and the operational issues. They did quite a detailed review of all of the different technical issues that might be involved in running a power system with these very, very different technologies. They found that that appears manageable. There's no reason we can think of, and I'll bet the engineers tried hard to think reasons why it won't work, and it appears manageable. And the costs, amazingly, the costs are comparable to alternative scenarios for Australia's future energy supply, which is amazing. And I think that is something that is quite special to Australia. I think if we did the equivalent study for Europe, for example, we would find that 100% renewable energy is quite a bit more expensive for Europe because they just don't have the resources that we have, the renewable resources. So we're very fortunate with our, not only the fossil fuel resources that we've been blessed with, but also with these amazing renewable resources. And we've just moved to renewables, of course, we have all the other benefits. We have a very low-risk power system, and this is one of the areas that we're now doing more modelling to understand the risks that we expose ourselves to if we depend upon emissions-intensive fossil fuel energy, and we're exposing ourselves to these rising gas prices and rising carbon prices. We're exposing ourselves to a lot of volatility potentially in those fuel markets and carbon markets. We'll also have a zero-emissions power system, and we'll be investing in an export industry that is long-term sustainable. unlike the coal industry, for example. And we would be ensuring long-term international competitiveness for Australia, which is something that is a threat at the moment, particularly if we continue to rely on exporting coal as a growing part of our economy, which is the plan at the moment. This is another part of the research that we're looking into, is the risk of continuing to rely on export of coal and what the risk that exposes us to in Australia. So thank you very much for the chance to speak with you, and I look forward to answering some questions.
Cool. Thanks a lot. Excellent. I might get Tim up here as well, because I imagine there might be a few questions from the floor.
Or not?
Or not. No, we answered everyone's questions. Yep.
It's very nice to have those figures. We say 500 times the demand. Could you just say something about the efficiency? Whether there is an efficiency factor in that?
Now the recoverable electricity, that's 500 times, and that's what you can get with those technologies.
Yeah, so that...
again, with the, with the numbers that involve geothermal or wave, you might say, well, hold on, I'm not so sure about whether geothermal or wave is going to come along, but there's still going to be a heck of a lot of solar out there. And that's just, look at the polygons you saw. I mean, if you wanted to cover Western Australia and Northern Territory, etc., there's a lot more out there. So, no, those are the numbers you can produce with the technologies that we currently have. And then it just comes back to the cost factor.
Yeah, so as in those numbers on the electricity you can produce, so they've already taken into account, any either thermal inefficiencies in
that's right.
That's stations or the conversion efficiencies of solar cells and that sort of thing.
Yeah, and like with the wind, if the site only has a 35% capacity factor, well, then that's and that's why the consultants did those 3 pieces. So if anybody here, PhD students or whatever, we have some of those here tonight, if you want to go back and tear that apart, what AEMO did, go back to the beginning, with the beginning part of the data, and apply different factors or different efficiencies for conversion, you can come up with some slightly different numbers, so you can tear it apart.
What about the regulatory regime for wind in Victoria? Was that factored in? Because my understanding is that given the supply, there's no extent.
Yeah, with what Rome did, they didn't assume that we had the current regime that we have in Victoria. They did take population centres into account as land use, so they went through an exclusion process, but it would have reflected more the regime we had before with the current rules, and similar to the other states. So yeah, if you put those overlays on there, then we won't have 500 times, we'll only have 450.
We've got various plans here talking about 100% renewable energy, but in fact that 100% represents different total amounts, because in the case of AEMO we're talking about 100% of existing electricity demand. In the case of BZE, we're talking about a figure which is between 40 and 50% greater than that, because we're talking about transitioning all of other fossil fuels to electricity, to renewable electricity, that is. And then we have, post the buildings plan, we have a figure where the amount of electricity envisaged in the stationary energy plan is actually reduced by at least 10% because of greater efficiencies. So perhaps the speakers could maybe speak to that question in terms of working out what it's going to cost us.
Sure, I might have the first crack at that. I might actually slip back to one of Jenny's earlier slides here, with $1 billion of capital costs on those AEMO scenarios, and then the wholesale cost per unit of electricity. And while each, in say the AEMO scenarios, I don't think I have a graph on any of the slides, but the difference in terms of the amount of electricity generated under each of those was I think from scenario 1 2030 to scenario 2 2050 was, I think maybe 50% more, like 150% difference in terms of total amount of electricity, because I had different assumptions in there about how much electricity demand would grow. But that doesn't lead to a doubling of the cost of electricity. It leads to a significant increase in the billions of dollars being spent. 219 billion versus 330 billion. But it's averaged out over a larger amount of electricity. So I mean, when you get your power bill, you're not really worried, or it probably doesn't mean much to you to know that, say, $5 billion was spent on the distribution network last year or anything like that. I mean, over the last few years, we've had something like $40 billion spent on just the low voltage distribution network. What matters is not the $1 billion, but what that translates to in terms of that cost average out of all the electricity being consumed. And so in that sense, if there's more demand, then we build more generation, whether it's wind and solar plants or coal and gas, and that doesn't sort of double or triple the cost of electricity. It just changes the amount of investment. So I guess my point would be that while that is a factor, whether we have energy efficiency and we keep demand flat, or whether we increase our electricity a lot more because we're not using gas for heating, we're using electric trains and cars, that'll affect the total amount that we need to generate. It'll affect the amount of billions of dollars we need to invest, but it's not really going to affect something like the cost of electricity very significantly. Does that help?
The other barriers come down to institutional frameworks that have been in place for a very long time, and it even comes down to the people who work in those organisations have worked with conventional power sources for their entire careers, and we're talking about something really different to that. So it does need to do the kickstart, actually, to get people thinking differently. And I think this AEMO study is a massive part of kickstarting that rethink about what these systems look like. AEMO does do long-term planning scenarios. They do the National Transmission Network Development Plan each year, and they're developing the scenarios for that at the moment and what they should look like. It would be unlikely that they'll do 100% renewable scenarios as a part of that, but they certainly are pushing boundaries more than they have before in terms of looking at more diverse scenarios, which is really, I had a question before about how do we know what the demand is going to be. I mean, that's absolutely true. We don't know what the demand will be. It could be widely different. There's so much uncertainty at the moment, and that's why we look at diverse scenarios, to try and understand the spectrum of what those costs should be. And we're only just beginning to understand how diverse those scenarios could be. We've been surprised a couple of times, particularly with the uptake of solar photovoltaics recently. No one expected that it could possibly be at that scale. So we need to be considering stretch scenarios far beyond what we have before. But I would say a really important thing that we could do to get these, particularly the AEMC, the Australian Energy Market Commission, on board with thinking about renewables, would be to change the national electricity objectives so that it included a statement around environmental objectives. So that this statement is the statement that the AEMC has to compare all rule changes to, that it must meet increase, for example, the safety or the efficiency or the cost effectiveness of the power system. And it could be added to that statement that it also should increase the environmental sustainability of the power system. That's not a consideration for the AEMC at the moment, but a lot of people are now starting to say that it should be, and we should adjust the NEO, National Electricity Objectives, to that end.
Is there any thought being put into localised electricity generation? I think the Americans are calling this microgrids, where I would have thought that would have a big impact on a number of these thoughts, particularly in the loss of energy as you cart at long distances. I would have thought that the scenarios with the polygons could give you a lot of opportunity for local generation.
In the AEMO work, they did factor in some rooftop PV, more than what we have today, for those 2030 and 2050. I don't know if anyone else wants to take that question.
Yeah, I think so, yeah. So if we look at the losses in the transmission system, they're around 5 to 7% of the energy that gets lost by transmitting it over the transmission network, even quite long distances on average, which is not all that big actually. If you compare the efficiency of a solar panel on someone's roof compared to the efficiency of a large utility scale solar plant that's in the desert, the difference will be a lot bigger in favour of the utility solar plant actually. They're just much more efficient and can be maintained properly. Roof panels on people's roofs get dirty and they may not be installed properly, and there's all sorts of reasons why they don't produce as much energy as a utility scale plant does. So it's complex. You need to take into account those losses, but also keep in mind that they are relatively small. And as we saw, even the cost of the transmission network is relatively small. It's only about 5 to 7% of your bill goes towards paying for those high voltage transmission lines. Most of your bill is going towards paying for the low voltage distribution network. So if you can install local solar panels on your roof and reduce the cost of your local low voltage network, then that's massively valuable. What we're finding is that peak demand in most residential areas actually happens in about 7 or 8 at night in the early evening, and that's when our solar panels aren't operating. Where solar panels can really help is on commercial buildings, because commercial buildings tend to have a demand profile that's operating at its peak in the middle of the day, around 1 or 2 in the afternoon with air conditioning loads. So if you use solar panels on commercial buildings, they can help to reduce those local network costs, and that's where they can have immense value. So we really need to start thinking much smarter about how we're rewarding people and incentivizing people based upon the value that they're providing to reducing those grid costs, particularly the local grid costs.
I'll have a quick answer to that as well. As we mentioned, we're looking at the modelling. The thing about 100, if you try and do 100% renewables instead of 50 or even 90, is that you've really got to think about what's the worst case scenario when there isn't wind and sun for an extended period of time. And all these studies have confirmed the thinking that basically there's a big benefit into having renewable energy spread over a larger scale, because the weather patterns in one area will be balanced out by the weather patterns in another, and they'll reduce the frequency of those times when it gets really bad. But also, when you do have those times when there's low sun and wind, it means you have to share, in effect, share the storage infrastructure across the whole grid. So, if you, as opposed to the system, to go to the other extreme end of the scale, we've had everyone with solar panels on the roof and then having to have their own battery bank. With a few days or even more, like a week's worth of storage just to get them through those few times. Even if batteries cost the same, cost the same as large-scale storage because they don't get more expensive, you probably find you're a lot more efficient. You need a lot, the total amount of battery storage everyone individually would need is a lot more than what you do if everyone in fact shares the storage. And also, and that's sort of a combination of that plus the averaging out effect of the renewable energy resource. And even in the buildings plan recently released, we did find that you could probably install something like 15 times more solar capacity than is currently installed, as the order of magnitude of those other studies. We did look at individual storage, but recommended suburban level storage. So, in particular cases where you had a lot of solar and a lot of rooftops in a small cluster, and that meant that the local transmission grid was overcrowded basically, and you need to invest more money in upgrading it. Instead of upgrading the grid, you can just upgrade, provide a local battery, so all of the power could flow into a battery at the suburban level and then flow back down to households in the evening. And that also would probably be a more efficient way of doing things than individual batteries. But then again, many other purchases in our economy are highly rational. We're doing the transport plan, and it's amazing to see the amount of money people spend on cars, or iPhones or anything like that. And so there's actually a big trend at the moment, a market emerging in Germany, where low-cost batteries at the household level with combined toll systems starting to take off as well. And that is going to continue to have the effect, which has already been quite revolutionary in Germany, because Germany's got so much solar panels already installed. It's provided that much of a disruption to the existing energy system that in effect that's been the stop that the energy, the big energy companies have needed to go, whoa, what's going on here? We've got to think about it in the future. And so in that way, that actually impacted lots of people making that small decision and just saying, I don't care, it's going to cost me a bit more, or I'll take the feed-in tariff subsidy and it'll cost me the same. But that act of having some solar generation and taking away from big utilities is affecting very large scale change in the grid. Nathan's question.
Yeah, my question was in relation to, on the radio show, my question was in relation to the death spiral and the fact of, which I'm sure probably people in this room are probably familiar with, with regards to the fact that the death spiral is potentially happening as a result of photovoltaics and people coming off the grid and energy efficiency, etc. What are the levers that AEMO and government can pull to reverse this? Because the death spiral assumes that we do nothing and that it just continues to cascade out of control. What are the levers that can be pulled to arrest the death spiral from like a policy point of view?
Jenny, do you want to crack that?
I had a little bit of trouble hearing.
Yeah, sure. Matt's question was basically about the death spiral, the solar PV death spiral, and for those in the audience who didn't catch it, that's basically the phenomenon that we're starting to see now, where the cost of having the distribution network and the grid is basically a fixed cost. There's an amount of poles and wires out there which has an asset value of X billion dollars. I think probably something in the order of 50 from memory. $50 billion, and the cost of having that is kind of this average over everyone's household bills. So, as was on that graph before, about 40% of the charge per kilowatt hour goes to paying to have the distribution network there. As people put on, the thing about in Australia is that our electricity demand over the last few years has actually started to go down instead of up. And it's the first time it's gone down instead of up for pretty much the history of having electricity. So it's been quite a shift. That's due to a lot of things. It's due to energy efficiency. It's due to people putting solar panels on the roofs. It's due to a few large industrial players shutting down. It's due to warm weather. There's a whole bunch of reasons where it's going down. And particularly, and that means that while we've invested more money in having the grid, there's less electricity to be sold to average cost over. So the electricity bill goes up even more. And as that happens, there's even more of an incentive for people to say put solar panels on the roof because it's worth their money. It's worth their while to save money. Which then further reduces the amount of electricity that's being bought from the grid, but the amount of grid there is still the same, so it drives prices up. And so more people put solar panels on the roofs and prices go up again. Okay, the death spiral. And it is a bit of an issue because we kind of do still need to have grid there. Jenny, do you have any ideas how to solve that?
Yeah, sure. And something that we've only really started to think about is in the last year or two with the explosion in photovoltaics. This has started to become a reality that people are using less energy, and that means that people who don't have photovoltaics are paying more because we're charging electricity network tariffs to some extent a kilowatt hour basis. But it's really driven by how much you're using at time of peak demand. It should be really charged based on how much you're using just in that peak demand hour, because that's where all the costs are coming. So it's a fundamental mismatch in the way that we've been charging electricity and the way we've been providing these signals, price signals to customers. So the most important thing that has to happen is that we change the way we provide those price signals to customers. So customers are going to have to get a little bit more intelligent about understanding the way that their electricity bill works. It's not just the charge in cents per kilowatt hour. Electricity bills are going to have to become more complicated, and it's probably going to include, at the very least, something that will show you when peak demand is and show you that there's a huge cost to the system of you using every additional megawatt or kilowatt rather at that time of peak demand. So it might be that network companies simply move to a time of use tariff But I suspect that once we start down this path, they're going to get a lot smarter and very innovative around the way that they charge those network tariffs, providing better signals to people and also giving people a better deal. So some people might want to have a flat charge and not be exposed to that risk and very high prices at time of peak, but they will they'll charge a higher premium for that. So you have options on how you want to pay your electricity. So I think that's the first thing, that network companies need to get smarter about how they charge their tariffs and are more innovative. And the regulator, the Australian Energy Regulator and governments as well, need to change the way that they assess network companies to give them that flexibility to be innovative. Because I would bet that there are all sorts of restrictions that prevent that at the moment in the way that network companies are assessed and regulated. So we need to think very carefully about where those limitations are. And the AEMC has been doing a review to that end through the Power of Choice review, just starting down that path. And there's a lot more work to be done yet, I think. The ultimate end, if storage, household storage that we were talking about before, if that comes along and actually becomes cost effective for people, or if people are just irrational and want to do it anyway, which is quite possible, as Pat was saying, network companies are going to need to think hard about how are they going to keep people connected to the grid, because it's a very expensive asset, and if people aren't using it and therefore aren't paying for it, it basically goes on the government's book. And then we have this huge stranded asset that nobody's using, but we will pay for, which is ridiculous. So we need to then, in that situation, if that is going to happen, we probably need to start shadow pricing the network so that it's an attractive alternative for people. And that might mean that you're paying a price that's cheaper than what it actually costs to build the network in the first place. At least someone is using it and getting some value. And that will mean there's a debt on the government book because we've paid for this network, we're still having to pay off the debt that we've invested in that network. So we kind of hope that it doesn't go that way, but it is quite conceivable, and we're only just starting to understand where that goes at the moment.
One last question.
Thank you to the speakers, and it's been much appreciated. My name is Ewan Nicol. I'm reminded of a meeting we had at Victoria University with Ian Loewe back in 2006, when he got up and made a preposterous statement, it seemed at the time, that Australia, the insulation on Australia in one day was sufficient for the rest of the world for a year. That's what he said. He also said that we could supply our own for the whole of Australia off a 50 kilometre by 50 kilometre area of solar. Now, okay, they seemed way out at the time, but what you're speaking about tonight, the good news sounds that it's heading in that direction. I wonder whether we've looked at Buckminster Fuller's Genie group that talked about us transporting energy offshore via some system that covers the world, whereby we have the day-night scenario being possible. Again, another way out thought from a long, long time ago. But I guess what I'm asking is, where do we go from here with this good news so that Joe Average starts to understand what's going on, and by that means we start to influence where politics in this place might change?
Very good question.
1 minute.
Talking about the insulation here, that sounds a bit wild, but he was right about the solar. Yeah, we've got last one's the solar. Look, that's where BZE has been trying to do all we can, and we're a relatively small organisation, big scary things, but they're trying to punch above our weight. I guess I see the main thing we've tried to do is to try and get more people asking the right questions. We put out the idea you could do 100% renewable energy, and then the team at UNSW, and then now the Australian Energy Market Operator came along and was able to say, well, let's have a more detailed look at that, and through their much bigger resources and minds, we're able to find better ways of doing it, confirm yes, it can be done, and allow us to really get into the details of saying, well, it's going to cost that much more. And in that same sense, I guess BZE is certainly still about doing this sort of thing, but as you said at the start, coming out there and giving presentations and talking to people about this and spreading that message. So a lot of people here tonight I know have been involved in a while. for a while, and our presenters have different presenters, have given stalls or done other public outreach elsewhere. If you're not, or if you haven't heard much about us before, then please consider getting involved. Volunteer your time, donate to help us keep going with the small amount of staff that we have. This is something that will be solved when more people understand. I mean, information doesn't change everyone's minds, but we've certainly seen over the last few years that it's changed a lot of people's minds with the small routes that we have had. So, yeah, I encourage everyone to get involved. I'll leave it there. About to finish up I'd like to extend a special thanks to Tim for coming along. He did some amazing work in getting involved in that study with AEMO, making that happen. And Jenny, you're very lucky to hear from Jenny. She's more. There's actually our radio show interviewed Jenny recently, so there's also a podcast of that up on the website, and if you check out her website, Jenny Riesz, Jenny.Riesz, or you Google it, she's written quite prolifically over the past couple of years on Climate Spectator and other sources as well. So, writing very well written articles explaining some of the stuff more, so I do check those out as well. Thanks for your time.
Will the slides we've seen this evening from the three speakers be available?
Yeah, the other speakers, and I think we can make as well. Cool. All right, we'll do it.
Okay, there's not much more I can say. To take what Pat said a little bit further, most people here should realise that this coming Sunday there's a really big climate action rally at Treasury Place in Melbourne. Tell as many people about it as you possibly can. It's only by community action, I think, that we're going to win this, and we've got to get the community at large to realise what the problem is and be prepared to vote for it before politicians will change their minds. So next month, the discussion group topic is 2013, a win for grassroots activism, with a panel of exciting speakers to be confirmed soon. And we'll be back to the first Monday in the month back here for that talk. And that's it from us, and I'd like to again thank the three speakers.